Welcome, everybody. I'm Steve Kraus. I'm Executive Director of MRII, that's Market Research Institute International. We're a nonprofit devoted to education and training in the world of market research. And I'm pleased to be joined by Jon Last, longtime board member of MRII, as well as president of the Sports and Leisure Research Group. And in my humble opinion, one of the foremost prognosticators about consumer behavior and consumer mindsets. Jon, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me again. Boy, that's a pretty strong endorsement to have to live up
Okay. A lot to live up to here in the next 10 minutes, but you got the goods. And in particular, you have been tracking since the beginning of the pandemic consumer attitudes and mindsets through your back to normal barometer. And I understand that today you're here to give us a sneak peek of some unreleased data from the latest wave.
Yeah, it's this has been a fascinating odyssey. I think, as I may have mentioned on this broadcast in the past, we thought we would be doing this for 2 or 3 months, and here we are 36 waves later, and we're still at it. But it's fascinating as we move perhaps out of the prime COVID influenced phase into this post-pandemic world, as people are saying, to see, what issues are really still predicating people's behavior, as well as ways in which we've seen some really significant shifts in people's attitudes and how that influences everything from spending to leisure pursuits. It's also fascinating, given the extensive work that we do in the leisure and sports space, to see how so much of this work that we're now doing on more of a macro basis really dovetails into some of that proprietary work. I think it's made us all smarter as researchers and strategists, just having a command of these macro perspectives and seeing that kind of bear out in some of the other more tactical things that we're looking at for our clients.
That sounds great. Sounds great. So, what are some of the highlights from the latest wave?
So a lot of things going on, and I think what's really fascinated us is just kind of you've seen all of this buildup in people's concerns about the economy, and in July, August, it really kind of came to a head. And to give you a sense of some of the ways in which that's happened, we're seeing, for example, we've been asking since the beginning of the barometer, people's agreement or disagreement that we are in recession. And I know that, when the last figures came out in terms of second quarter GDP, there was lots of discussion about, well, what's the real definition of recession versus the classic economist definition. And, we want to step back and say, what's the people's definition? And we saw 57% of Americans agree that, strongly that we were in recession in July. And that was a 7-point significant jump from what we saw in June. It was also the highest we've seen since before the pandemic. We also saw some 70% agree that they're spending less on multiple items in response to price increases. 81% agreeing that they were more budget conscious today than they were 2 years ago. So despite the jockeying that we may have seen in terms of definition, people are really feeling the crunch. But right in lockstep with that and diametrically opposed to it to some degree, people have continued to put the pandemic behind them in terms of their behaviors, particularly when it comes to leisure activities. A couple of statistics that just kind of jumped out at us that were also barometer highs. We saw almost 70% agree with the statement, it's time to move on from concerns about COVID and just learn to live with it. We saw 70% also a barometer high say that relative to other issues, COVID-19 just isn't that important to me. 56%, the highest since October of last year, believing that they have immunity to COVID. So you look at all that, and people are getting out and about and doing things. And, so on the one hand, they're saying, well, we're being a little bit more conscientious about what we spend on. We continue to see the spending on leisure and travel lag, not be as effective, be more immune to these inflationary concerns relative to consumer goods. And I think we've got some good rationale as to why.
Yeah, I think that, like you said, people are just kind of mentally saying, you know what, I'm over it in terms of the COVID thing. And I think part of that is there's just so much uncertainty in other aspects of life. I always used to say that, well, we all know that the media comes up with a new headline every week, Well, now it seems like there's a new defining issue of our time every week.
Yeah,
There was the global pandemic. Well, I'm kind of over that. And now there's inflation, and then there's monkeypox, and there's an insurrection, and then there's Roe versus Wade, and we've got midterms, and there's just so much going on. I think there's kind of this bifurcation of people saying, yeah, things out there are crazier than ever, and I'm not very optimistic about the economy. But in terms of my own personal decisions, I'm going to move on. I'm going to get out. I'm going to travel. I'm going to have fun, that kind of thing.
yeah, I think that's a good way to say it. And I think it'll be interesting when we think about what people's concerns are. I think there's a lot to be learned from this, whether you're thinking about it from a political perspective or thinking about it from a consumer products perspective. We've asked about what are the issues that are most concerning to Americans throughout the study. And really going back, when we began this earlier this year and over the last 3 months, inflation continues to top the list overall. Tensions with Russia are right behind that. Crime, even lack of confidence in federal government leadership, all higher than the COVID pandemic, all higher than perhaps certain social issues or even climate change, which I think are interesting if you think about how that could shape the positioning that different candidates may take. Now, that said, and I think we see this manifest itself in the primaries, there's obviously this huge discrepancy between people based on their ideological lean. And while something like inflation or tensions with Russia are top of the list, from a bipartisan standpoint, the fervor with which people have across these different issues do vary and do kind of tend to skew towards the ways that you might think they would based on where somebody's own belief systems rise. But I think one of the other things that really jumped out at us this month, and it was a new question that we hadn't asked before, was what, if anything, has transformed. Now, if they do feel that they are kind of past the pandemic, we started by asking, has the pandemic significantly transformed how we live in America? And I thought that, like a lot of questions, might have been very split. We had 82% agreement with that supposition.
Wow.
And, we obviously wanted to dig a little deeper into that. So the follow-ups on it were really in what ways. And methodologically, we put together a pretty interesting way of trying to measure the magnitude of a lot of issues. Like these, when you think about ways that the pandemic has transformed how people live, what's gotten stronger and what's gotten weaker. I think when you look at what's on either side of that, it's really interesting. So let me kind of dive into that a little bit, just kind of tease it.
Yeah.
On the stronger side, you have leisure, you have desire to take a vacation, you have desire to spend time outside of the home. On the weaker side, you have work and career, desire to live in cities, and trust in government. Fascinating stuff. I mean, it's kind of a reflection and perhaps a substantiation of what we were talking about just a moment ago, in that people are putting a priority on things that maybe they didn't put a priority on in the past. And another data point kind of speaks to that. We've been asking since going way back to last summer, the bigger question about compared to pre-pandemic times, where are price points? And that's not as empirical a measure as real inflationary economics, but it's more about perceptions. It's more about value, right? How people see things. So we're continuing to see in July, 75% of consumers saying that prices for consumer goods are somewhat or much higher now than they were pre-pandemic. That's right in line with where we were in April. High point was in May when it was at 78. It dipped back a little bit into June and then came back up again in July. But travel and leisure have consistently lagged. And we know that from a price index standpoint, they haven't been immune to increases. But in the mind of the consumer, there's still a certain value that's being derived out of those activities that is substantially lower than what we're seeing amongst how people feel about consumer goods. It's caught up a little bit. It's certainly moved in an upward trajectory, but it still lags behind the consumer goods. And I find that to be, again, another reflection of how priorities aren't going to get in people's way in terms of inflation blocking people's desire to get out and actualize, particularly in things that they maybe were somewhat constrained or unwilling to pursue over the last 2.5+ years.
Yeah, I think that sense of sharpened personal priorities is something that I see really strongly as well. Of people say, yeah, I want to move on. It's interesting that, people are kind of mentally saying we're in a recession. Economists can disagree over definitions, but I think that the consumers are there, but they're not necessarily letting that stop them from spending, from traveling, even something like work from home. Where more companies are starting to push to get people back in the office, and I think people are really pushing back very strongly. Or
Yeah, and that's a great point, and something that I know we've been monitoring from the onset. We have seen work in the office exclusively rise since the early parts of this year. The latest data has about 42% of people who are in that situation exclusively working in the office, but that's only 42%. There's still 30% that are in a hybrid. There's 28% who are still predominantly at home. And those who strongly value the ability to work at home at 50% is at its highest level since February.
yeah.
It's interesting. In another study that we did with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which I know is available on their site, we've been doing a series of waves of research for them about people who left their jobs or lost their jobs during the pandemic and haven't gone back. And the number escapes me right now off the top of my head, but it was something like 65+% who said that, if they were going back in the workplace, the ability to have that flexibility was going to be an absolute table stake before they considered taking that job. And I think that's in some ways what continues to hurt the service sector, given some of the labor stresses that we continue to see. And that's very evident as well, something that we've been tracking in the barometer for quite some time that continues to be at a fairly high level, is the percentage of folks that say that the resumption of these activities that were limited during the height of the pandemic has been very underwhelming relative to their perceptions and recollections prior to COVID. 56% agree with that, which is the highest we've seen. With May being on par, that's the highest we've seen since last October. So again, you've got all these things. You've got inflation driving people to be a little bit more scrutinizing. You've got overall economic malaise. You've got people wanting to come back, and they're still not even getting the experience they had before, but they're still trying.
One of the phrases that I hear more and more, and maybe it's just because the TikTok algorithm has pegged me as a person interested in this issue, but I hear more and more the phrase quiet quitting, of people saying, yeah, I'm going to work, but I'm not going to go above and beyond. I'm not going to kill myself for this job. And in some cases, people are saying, I'm not going to kill myself for this job because I still want to work on my side gig. I still want to keep building my personal brand. So I think that sharpened sense of personal priorities comes through there as well.
Yeah, that we dug a little bit further into that again in the work for the chamber, and it's interesting because here's where being a researcher is really important, to separate your own personal ethic from what you're seeing elsewhere. This is how I guess I get to sense that maybe I'm getting older, because that was never an option for me. I always, owning my own company was something that I felt I did even when I didn't. You always got to learn, act like you're the owner of the company. That's certainly not evident in a lot of the data that we're seeing now about people's attitudes and their desire for flexibility. And it's not a judgment statement. I mean, everybody's got their own priorities, and everybody wants to do things the way that's going to make them comfortable. I think that the really thoughtful business owners need to take that into consideration in how they structure the tasks within their organizations. In our company, the simple rule is, do it on your own time and get it done. And that's all that we really, that's what counts, right?
Yeah. Well, and not to plug MRII, but sales of our courses are way up, and in part it's individuals buying the courses because they want to strengthen their skills and maybe change jobs and so on. But it's also a fair amount of companies looking for ways to keep their staff happy and retain their staff. And we know that millennials are very into learning and education and training. So I think a lot of that speaks to that notion that companies are realizing they're going to have to respond differently to this environment.
Yeah, and I mean, the whole nature of training, I mean, again, not to plug the program that we both are so in tune with, but with the introduction of the Principles Express courses a couple of years ago, it was a recognition by all of us that people's learning styles have called for greater flexibility. It's not like you've got to sit rigorously as if you're in a school program. You take the course when you need it and as you need it, and it's flexible and self-taught and online and on demand.
Yeah.
It gives you those basic skills that you need to elevate yourselves, but on your own terms.
Well, we got just a couple minutes left. Any other big highlights from your Back to Normal barometer you wanted to share?
I think I've covered most of what we've looked at. I'll add one more that kind of will be worth watching, particularly as we move into the fall. We've got something in the barometer that we call our stress meter, where we ask people basically, how does their current level of stress compare to a month ago, and where do they think it will be a month from now compared to where they were today? People, I guess, maybe it's the coming of the school year and the end of summer and all of that, but that's at a high point that we've seen, that we haven't seen since last fall. 39% feeling much more stressed than a month ago, and 38% thinking it's going to be the same a month from now. And gosh, we were back in the 20s in November, and haven't seen something as high as the high 30s going back to early part of last fall. So it'll be interesting again as we move, into the normal buildup that one sees in business and education in the fall versus where we were in summer. That continues to escalate in conjunction with some of the economic news as we get closer to the midterm elections. But that's part of what makes the barometer fun to do, because you never know what's going to emerge next.
There you go. And for better or worse, like you said, you've only planned to do it for a few months, and now you're going into 3 years. But now you got all the great trending data, and you can see the seasonality in your data. Things like back to school translates into higher stress.
Yeah, no, it'll be interesting, especially to see where things go for vacation planning. A lot of our travel clients, as travel has opened more up again, the cruise industry in particular just recently uh, making some pretty significant changes and relaxing some of the requirements for boarding ships. It will be really intriguing to see. So far, the really early reads that we have on it, and we're actually about to go into the field with another study for our friends at the American Society of Travel Advisors, ASTA, to gauge, what people's behaviors and attitudes are going to be like as we head into the holiday travel season. Obviously, we've got a couple of really good years of direct comparative to look at with that.
Sounds great. We will keep an eye out for that. Well, Jon Last, thanks very much. Everybody, as always, can follow Jon's ideas on Media Post, where he writes every month, as well as on the website. And I appreciate you giving us the sneak preview into unreleased findings today, Jon. Thank you.
Always great to be with you, and hope people find this interesting.
Sounds great. All right. We'll talk again soon, Jon. Take care.
Thanks so much. Look forward.